Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your producer and host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy topics as well as on their life experience. You will learn a lot whether you are an energy aficionado or a newbie. And one of my favorite parts of the podcast is when guests share about their personal trajectories. I always find it authentic and inspiring. And it's great to be back. Our loyal listeners have noticed the Energy Vista podcast was on a long summer break and to recharge our batteries. So let me explain. One, I have many different identities, and don't we all? I'm an energy professional, a businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a mother, a wife, Frenchie, arty, yogi, foodie, and many other things. But with the coronavirus pandemic, it definitely took a lot of my energy as a mother, and I think this is very widespread depending on the school and family situation. So over the past few months, I had to reorganize my life and my priorities. No, I didn't flee New York yet, and I'm still there. And also, I'm doing the podcast as a hobby on the side because I enjoy it. It inspires me and others, and it creates debate and spread knowledge. So I will make a point in continuing it, even if it's not on a regular basis. And despite all the competing priorities that beset my life right now, the coronavirus is not going to take away that from me. I'm closing the parenthesis, my personal parenthesis, and to welcome Romany Webb for this great Energy Vista episode. Romany is a climate law fellow at the Sabin Center at Columbia University. We will discuss two timely topics today. One is the status of methane emissions in the US and maybe globally. And we'll delve into Romany's personal trajectory too. Hi, Romany.
Hi, Leslie.
Thank you very much for joining the Energy Vista podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and to create the time. Let's delve right into the topic of the day. Increasingly, there is a trend towards greater scrutiny of methane emissions. So let me remind our listeners, methane is a potent gas that we find in the atmosphere, especially when there is leaky gas pipelines and infrastructure. And it's also often found when gas, oil are burned around the gas fields and oil fields, also in farming. And it's more potent even than CO2, at least for 20 years in the atmosphere, correct?
Correct. It is much more potent than carbon dioxide, around 34 times more potent than carbon dioxide if you look at it over a 100-year time horizon. But you're right, is has a much shorter life in the atmosphere. So the main reason we worry about it from a climate perspective is because it has a really important effect on near-term warming. It's contributing to the temperature increases that we're seeing right now, rather than the ones that we'll see in 100 years or 50 years.
Yeah. So it seems that the debate around methane emission in the US has become very politicized. And if we look at, if you can give us maybe a panorama of the regulatory status right now of methane emissions in the US. On my end, what I see, if I try to summarize quickly, it's that under the Trump administration, there has been a rollback of the Obama era restrictions on methane emissions. And the consensus is that if the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, wins the election, the methane rules will come back with a vengeance.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. In 2016, towards the end of the Obama administration, we had these new rules adopted, specifically targeting methane emissions from oil and gas facilities. Those 2016 rules only applied to sort of a subset of facilities, so-called new facilities that were constructed after 2015. They were incredibly controversial for a number of reasons. And pretty much as soon as President Trump took office, the new EPA began efforts to get rid of them. They took a number of steps to try and delay implementation of the rules. That failed, but for the last 3.5 years, they've been working on a number of proposals to weaken or eliminate them. And they actually finalized a proposal last month to get rid of the methane standards for these new oil and gas facilities, which has a really important legal consequence, because when you get rid of the standards for new oil and gas facilities, that removes a sort of regulatory requirement that the EPA would otherwise be under to start regulating existing oil and gas facilities, which are, of course, the key source of most of the methane emissions that we see. So that's been, for those of us who are worried about climate change, a troubling development. Interestingly, though, just last week, a federal court actually stayed or halted implementation of the new Trump-era withdrawal. So the 2006 rules, for now at least, remain in place while we wait for the outcome of the legal proceedings, the legal challenges to them. So it's been a highly action-packed couple of years around methane regulation, and I think you're right that if we see a Biden administration come in, it's only going to be more action in this area as we see the reinstatement or strengthening of those 2016 regulations, and then a move to start regulating existing facilities.
And is it that important that there is an active role of the government, or can companies set up their own targets and remain disciplined about it? Like how much of government intervention do we really need? Like I have the feeling that big, majors, big oil and gas companies, they know how detrimental it would be for their green branding, and shame on you kind of trend that we see. They know that they have be self-disciplined about it and restrain their emissions. Maybe not that much for the independent producers.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really important. Certainly, a lot of the majors have announced proposals to cut their methane emissions, and it remains to be seen whether they fulfill them, but they at least have the proposals. And I think you're right that if they don't meet them, then they do risk kind of losing their social license to operate. It's not necessarily true for the independents. So in that context, having this sort of regulatory backstop is really important. The other thing is, we hear, those of us who work on methane regulation hear all the time that regulation is unnecessary because the industry has an incentive, a financial incentive to reduce their methane emissions, because anything they don't emit is basically natural gas that they're capturing and then they can sell. In some contexts that works, but when we see examples like what happened during the start of COVID, where natural gas prices plummeted and we had sort of excess supply, that financial incentive goes away because it might cost you more to capture that gas than you can sell it for in those sorts of financial environments. So again, having that regulatory backstop is really important.
Mm-hmm. And it would also create, I guess, some kind of homogeneity and standards for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's really difficult at the moment is that there's no really good rules around measuring methane emissions from like oil and gas wells or pipelines or other things. So we just don't know how much is being released. So having regulations in place would establish a more consistent approach to measuring the emissions, and then also to combating those emissions, and ensure that systems are in place so that if for whatever reason operators don't want to voluntarily address the emissions, we're still controlling them.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that technology helps here with, better monitoring tools. It seems like every week we hear of a new tool, a new technology that pops up that will help track methane emission.
Some really interesting technologies around like satellite systems and like aerial monitoring using drones, all of which can help reduce the costs of measuring and monitoring the emissions.
So in Europe, right now, it seems that the European Union is kind of leading the way. The bloc is supposed to release a new methane strategy this month. And it seems that they have opted for more voluntary target setting. Why do you think they opted for this rather than binding standards?
I'm not, I sort of was not directly involved in any of that. So I'd be speculating, but I do think that the downturn we've seen in the industry has influenced the debate about regulatory standards. From my perspective, the downturn we've seen in the industry makes those regulatory standards more important for the reasons I said. But, there's also an argument that the industry is hurting, and any additional cost is going to make it hurt more and has sort of broader economic and job impacts. So I wouldn't be surprised if that had played into the debate happening around the standards.
Interesting. Yeah, so there will be an added cost, right, for greening the gas value chain.
Yeah.
And I think that the end customers are the ones that will end up paying for this premium, for this, methane-free premium, methane reduction premium. Do you think it should be spread all over the value chain, or if you're a consumer and you want to consume green electricity or green gas, you're the one who has to pay the extra cost?
I think in terms of, if we're talking about reducing methane emissions from the existing natural gas value chain, I think that to the extent that those methane emissions reductions generate cost savings, certainly there's an upfront cost in terms of installing the equipment, the capture equipment, or putting in place the monitoring systems. But over time, that should pay back and should actually save the operators money over time. So to the extent that we pass on costs in the short term, we should be passing on savings in the longer term. I think that that's sort of a fair way to do it, and I don't have a particular problem with that. The only other thing I would say is that, already in the United States, at least, if we're thinking about pipeline operators, all of us who receive gas from a pipeline operator and all of the large companies that transport their gas via pipeline operators, we already pay the costs of leakage, because the pipeline operators pass on to us the cost of any gas that they buy but that they can't deliver because it's lost through leaks. So we're already paying a cost here. It's just it's just a shifting of the cost.
Yeah. Globally, in the US and Europe, we see the start of a debate about what's the lifespan, how many years are left for natural gas infrastructure. For pipeline operators, is it worth for them to repair and to pay that much attention to leakage if they know that, there is maybe, 15 years left, 20 years left?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult trade-off. I think that it's important to recognize that even if we were to stop using fossil natural gas in 15 years, we might still want to use those existing pipelines for something else, whether it be like a renewable gas, a biogas, or some other commodity that needs to be transported. So there's real value to investing in those existing pipeline systems. But I agree with you that it's a challenge for the operators to sort of justify that investment if they think their pipeline's going to cease operating in a set number of years.
The other reason also maybe why the European Union opted for a gradual approach is that it has a consequence. It would have a consequence on trade of gas, for instance. And I think, since there are some negotiations going on between the EU and the US on the trade deal, I think the Trump administration wouldn't have well reacted to the fact that US gas suppliers were considered as less competitive because too dirty. If they had been penalties, put on them.
Absolutely, that would not go well with the Trump administration's trade negotiator. No.
Do you think it can play differently under a Biden administration?
I think we've already seen from the proposals that have been announced that the Biden administration is going to be much more active on climate change. Certainly, I think the recent statements that Biden has made around, for example, fracking and things like that shows that he still continues to see a role for natural gas, at least for the foreseeable future. But I do think we can expect a shift in some of these positions on things like methane emissions. And, based on the climate plans he's released, it seems like his position would be, to the extent we continue using natural gas, we should be making it as clean as possible, which makes good sense from a climate perspective and also from an economic perspective, assuming the market rebounds and these sort of capture systems become more economically feasible again.
Yeah. And on my end, I definitely see that, U.S. upstream suppliers are definitely becoming more involved in methane reduction initiatives, and because they see it as as a way to sustain their competitiveness also, because a large part of US gas now is being exported. I mean, it's one of the main outlets as LNG, liquefied natural gas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you also about bioenergy, biogas. Do you see it as becoming a larger part of our energy mix? And when we read about it in the press or we hear about it in the media, it seems that there are two great benefits. One is that it would provide cleaner power, and two, that it could solve the issue of waste. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think if we're thinking about biogas, so these sort of methane-rich gases that are captured at agricultural facilities or landfills or wastewater treatment plants, that's one of the key benefits when you look at sort of the emissions profiles. A lot of why those gases are better than fossil natural gas from an emissions and climate perspective is because they involve the capture of methane at a farm or at a landfill that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. We haven't seen a huge amount of interest, I will say, in biogas, at least here in the United States. There's some proposals, some projects out in California that are injecting biogas into the natural gas pipeline system, but really haven't seen a whole lot of focus on it.
Is it because of cost or lack of governmental support?
I think mostly it's because of cost. It's just much more expensive. I've seen some figures that put it at like $5 to $10 per MMBTU. So it's just so much more costly. It's not competitive, and we don't have any sort of government support or sort of mandates to make it more competitive. Overseas, as you probably know, we're seeing a lot of interest in hydrogen in the EU, in Australia, in other places. We haven't really seen quite the same level of interest here in the United States, but I think that we could see more interest in hydrogen in the next few years.
Yeah, and the similarities between biogas and hydrogen is that they can both be blended as a complement with gas in pipelines.
Yeah, there is some added complexity when you're using hydrogen,
right?
Because particularly where you're using steel pipelines, it can cause cracking and
erosion.
Yeah, exactly, to those pipelines. So there's limits on how much hydrogen you can blend into the existing pipeline system. I think the limit's like 7% or something. But yeah, in theory, you could be replacing up to 7% of your fossil natural gas supply with hydrogen, which when it leaks out, it doesn't release any methane. And when you burn it at the other end, it doesn't produce any carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm. And do you see any? So we see that it's picking up more in Europe. Why do you think so? And do you think that under a Biden administration, there would be some more focus on those biogas and bioenergy?
Yeah, I think in Europe, Europe is just a little more advanced on its climate thinking. And, if you think about natural gas is often talked about as this bridge fuel. I think they're further across the bridge than we are here in the United States. Our climate policy is just a bit behind. And, there's still very much a focus on, well, natural gas is better than coal, so let's move to natural gas. And we haven't thought about that next step so much. I think it's a little bit difficult to say sort of how hydrogen will play out under a Biden administration. There are some challenges in using hydrogen in the existing pipeline system. I can see things like biogas picking up because, if we create a market for biogas, that's helps the agricultural community, which has traditionally been a very strong stakeholder in American politics. So that I can see potentially more so than hydrogen, but who knows?
Yeah, very interesting. Good. So it's time to move to your personal and professional trajectory. So Romany, you have a slight accent from Australia. I have a strong accent too, so no offense. So tell us about why you moved to the US. Was it to follow an American dream, continue your studies? Tell us a little bit about you stopped in California before moving to New York. So tell us about your study and your move.
Yeah, I moved to the US about 8 years ago, and I moved initially to California, to San Francisco, to the Bay Area, to do a Master's of Law at UC Berkeley. And while I was there, I was offered a job at UC Berkeley for after I graduated. So I spent an extra year there working with some other academics on a really interesting project looking at what the Obama administration could do in terms of executive actions to address climate change, assuming there's no new congressional action on the topic. So that was a really interesting project, very topical at the time because it was around the time that President Obama said he would use the full extent of his authority to address climate change, even if Congress didn't act. And after that, I moved to Texas, and I spent a couple of years in Austin at the University of Texas, doing working at a center that focused specifically on energy law. So I did a lot of work on oil and gas development and other sort of energy issues. And then nearly 5 years ago now, I moved to New York to work at Columbia.
And so how do you combine your law background with this energy and climate focus that you have?
So one of the interesting things about climate change is it's not really thought of as its own area of law. Certainly there are like climate change law textbooks, but really they just sort of borrow from all different areas of law. So, environmental law, energy law, corporations law, all these different areas. And so, having this sort of broad legal background is really useful when you're thinking about legal and policy issues specifically with respect to climate change, which implicates so many different fields and requires really a broad-ranging sort of whole sector approach.
And what about your Australian background? Like, do you compare what's happening in the US and in Australia in terms of climate change policies? And, there are many similarities in a way and many differences too. Like, how does it help you understand or analyze what you see here in the US now?
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually to compare the evolution, I think, of thinking around climate issues and energy issues in the two countries. When I came to the United States, I think that I had in my mind, and I think it's true at that time, the US was really almost leading on climate issues towards the end of the Obama administration, pushing for international action, looking at various domestic actions. Since then, we've sort of almost gone backwards. The trajectory, I think, has played out a little bit differently in Australia. Certainly, we had these sort of steps forward where, for example, the Australian government adopted what was effectively a carbon tax. But again, we've had the same steps back where that same carbon tax was gotten rid of a few years later. So we've seen this sort of a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences, particularly, I think, differences in sort of the community perception of climate issues. It's very much on the agenda, I think, in Australia and really entered the public consciousness in a way that I think is happening here in the United States, but perhaps not so much because we have so many other issues that we're focused on.
Yeah, on my end, what has been interesting also is that both countries are now large commodity exporters, and it's changing their geopolitical drivers and consideration also in terms of relationships with their regional neighbors, but also the main consumers of their commodities, which is interesting.
Yeah, both, relatively large fossil fuel exporters, particularly Australia, which I think has had a huge impact on its approach to climate change, particularly in recent years.
And what about the wildfire? We see, this more recent phenomenon both in the US and Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's very troubling, something that the two countries unfortunately have in common, just that their fire seasons are sort of next to each other. So, the firefighters travel from California to Australia to help them, and then the Australians travel to California to help them. It's a very troubling phenomenon, and one that we're only going to see more of, I think, in the next few years.
Yeah. Well, let's finish on a positive note. Are you still you were originally born somewhere else? How do you feel about the American dream? Like, do you feel as an immigrant, or you're completely American now? Like, how do you feel?
I think, I think it's different, frankly, for those of us who come from sort of an English-speaking background, and particularly a country like Australia that is very culturally similar to America.
Yeah.
But, you always feel, you always have an accent and you always feel a little bit different. But, I am overall very positive. I think the opportunities that have been presented to me personally here are really remarkable. And I'm very hopeful about the next few years and the opportunities for, really professional growth, given that I work in the climate space, and we might see a new administration that is more forward thinking on climate issues.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I definitely feel very alike in terms of opportunities that the US, had brought to me and that I may not have found elsewhere. Great. Great to hear. Thank you so much, Romany, for joining the Energy Vista podcast. And by the way, are you attending anything like online regarding the Climate New York week?
Yeah, we have lots of events. The Sabin Center is actually participating in or co-hosting a couple of events. So if people are interested, they should check out our website, Columbia Climate, for the details. There is lots of really interesting stuff going on. Even around the city, I'm seeing so many interesting events and webinars and things publicized on the link screens and other places. So everybody should get engaged.
Great. Thank you. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Leslie. This is fun.
Thanks. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on September 22, 2020. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.